Hello everybody and welcome to this video. So today we're going to be recapping round number 7 of the Melbourne International Open, and somehow I was still undefeated with 3 wins and 3 draws in the previous rounds. However, I was super nervous for this round because I felt I'd convinced myself that if I had gotten 3 wins, then 3 draws, what could come next but 3 losses? And this was a morning round. I was not feeling great. I was super scared. I also noticed that my opponent plays absolutely everything, so I had nothing really to prepare for apart from the fact he could play d4, he could play e4, c4, knight f3, he could play almost anything. So there wasn't really much to prepare. So instead, I decided to just try and get some rest and calm myself down, and to my happy surprise, at the board he played e4. I was really expecting something with d4 and having to play a dry, positional, not so fun game, but I love any time I get the chance to play the Sicilian. So I play c5, and yeah, I'm really happy about this. But one other thing that I knew was that my opponent liked to play very unorthodox and sort of strange openings that somehow seemed to work out for him. So I was getting prepared for maybe a wing gambit or some a3, some crazy stuff. But again, to my happy surprise, my opponent just plays normal stuff. He brings this knight out to f3, and then I play d6, and we trade the pawns in the center. I attack his pawn, and then he plays knight c3, and now I play a6, and we've got into a main line najdorf. So no crazy stuff just yet. And I'm thinking after a6, there's a lot of things that white can actually play here, so a lot of moves are okay. The most common are to develop this dark square bishop to e3 or to g5, and usually white is going to castle queenside and just go absolutely crazy, attacking the king on this side of the board, whereas black is going to move all their pieces in a way to start attacking the white king on the queen side. So really crazy stuff usually happening. And but apart from these moves, there's a lot of other moves that are possible, but I did not expect my opponent's move at all. Here he played a3, and this is just something that's really rare. It's not a bad move at all, but it's a really rare move. So I guess he's trying to get me to commit to choosing a setup with either e6 or e5, and then maybe he's going to decide where his pieces are going to go from there. But honestly, I didn't really feel that it was that much of a threatening move. Yes, white is still probably a bit better here, but now I get the chance to play e5, strike in the center, and attack this knight. And now again, on his next move, he surprised me again. Usually this knight is going to go to b3 or to f3. Now if the knight goes over on this side, this sort of indicates they want to bring out their pieces and castle on the queen side and play very aggressively. Whereas if the knight goes back to f3, it's just going to be supporting this king side, and usually white is planning to castle on the king side, just keep it more solid. But instead my opponent played a slightly strange move and moved their knight to e2. And yeah, this is again a good move. The idea behind it is that they usually want to make this push over here with f4, and they want to start attacking on the king side and use this knight to support that attack. So I thought about it here and realized there wasn't a really huge threat that my opponent was making immediately. So I decided that I would just develop my pieces and try and play normally. So I bring my bishop to e7, and then my opponent plays g3. Here I play queen c7, and some of you guys might be wondering why I'm not, bringing out this light square bishop or castling here. So I thought about bishop e6, but I thought the problem with this was that if he's pushing f4, then he can start pushing forward with f5 and attacking my bishop that's on e6. So it's going to come under attack on this side. So I thought instead maybe this bishop actually belongs on the b7 square and trying to target this e4 pawn. And I also decided that I wouldn't castle here just because I felt that my opponent wanted to play very aggressively by pushing all of their pawns on this side, and I didn't want to commit to putting my king anywhere just yet. Now, castling would have been perfectly fine and probably the best move, but I thought maybe we can see if my opponent wants to go crazy with pushing all their pawns, and then I'll decide whether I want my king to be in the way of this huge attack or whether I just want to keep it maybe even in the center. So here I decide on queen c7. He brings his bishop out to g2, which makes a lot of sense. This is what the point of this g3 push is, to put this bishop here. And then I put my knight on d7. So I'm just looking at developing the pieces. Again, I've got the same idea where I don't want to commit to castling just yet because I don't want to allow this huge attack. And now he plays h3. And the idea behind h3 is he is preparing to push g4. Obviously, he can't play that straight away because I would just capture the pawn. So he needs to prepare it somehow. And he uses this h3 pawn as a reinforcement, and now he's going to start pushing this g-pawn. I decide that when you see your opponent attacking on one side of the board, you got to try and attack on the other side. So I decide to push forward with b5 and think about maneuvering all my pieces over on this side. This knight maybe is going to go over to b6, controlling the d5 and c4 squares. This bishop can come up to b7 and target the e4 pawn, as I talked about. And we're just getting a little bit of space over on these b and c files here. So this looks quite nice. Although, when my opponent pushes g4, it does feel a little bit scary. There is the pressure on me, because if I just continue with developing my pieces, like going bishop b7 here, my opponent can push g5 and kick my knight away, force it over to this h5 square, and then my opponent might put this knight into d5 at some point, attacking my bishop and my queen now that this knight is no longer defending, so forcing me to give up the bishop pair. There's lots of moves that I feel look quite strong for my opponent. There's also even this idea of moving the bishop to f3, attacking the knight, and where does that knight even go? You can put it on f4, but then you will just lose a pawn after takes, takes, and takes, and this does not look fun at all. And then you could also play g6, but white is just going to take here, and then your chances of castling are ruined forever. And while you might be surviving here, it looks a little bit scary with these double pawns and the king being so open now. So I instead decide that I want to stop this g5 push altogether, so I play h6. And the good thing is he can't really go for this, going h4, preparing to push g5, because still my knight is controlling the square. So it's going to be a little while before this g5 push is possible. Alright, so now my opponent decides to develop their dark square bishop after all this time and brings it over to e3. So both sides not castling or not playing principled chess here, but somehow the position is still quite equal. Here I decide to develop this final minor piece. All of the other pieces have at least reached a new square. Now this bishop comes into play and it starts attacking this pawn on e4. My opponent then plays queen to d2. I was wondering whether this meant that he was hoping to castle queenside or whether there was a different idea behind this move. I think at the time I was thinking that my opponent was going to castle on the queen side, because that's usually what you're planning to do. Like when you push this queen up to the second rank, you're usually planning to castle queenside and then try and bring your rook in to put pressure down the center. So I decided that here I would start making a new plan, and this was based on how the queen and the bishop were now aligned, and also the way that we were trying to look at controlling the center. So I played knight to b6. So I developed this knight up here, and the plan is to come into this c4 square, potentially, where we could attack the bishop and the queen at the same time, also attacking this b2 pawn. So a lot of pressure would be put on all of these pieces if I'm able to bring this knight into c4. Otherwise, there's even plans to play d5 in the future. But for example, if they just castle like this, I'm going to put this knight over here, attack the bishop and the queen, and after the queen moves somewhere, I have the option to take, win the bishop pair, or just keep the pressure on, bring the rook into c8, and this knight is going to be really nice. So my opponent felt a little bit threatened by this knight and decided to just cut off this knight while he had the chance, and just captures on b6. And then I take back, of course, and here he plays knight to g3. And this was actually a move that I found a little bit annoying because my opponent was planning to come into this f5 square, and if the knight ever got there, it was going to be really strong. It was going to attack my bishop, my pawn on g7, this pawn on d6, and it was going to be a really good knight. So I decided that, again, I just can't let him bring this piece in. Like this, I shouldn't allow him to play knight to f5, because then it's just going to be such an annoying knight to have to deal with. So I decide here just to play g6. This is definitely a move that is committal. Now we're sort of opening up some holes around the king, so maybe we could argue that we're going to be a little less safe if we castle over here. Oh, and we actually can't think about castling in the future now, so this is another reason why it's committal. We won't be able to castle for at least a while because now this queen is targeting this h6 pawn. So for example, if they castle, I can't castle here because then the queen can just capture over here. Then the queen can just capture here on h6. Now in this line, this pawn over here on f2 is hanging, so this is not this is not exactly what would have happened, but I'm just trying to illustrate the fact that I can't castle because h6 would be hanging. Now my opponent castles on the king side, and I sort of wasn't expecting this. I was expecting the king to go this way, especially after he'd started pushing all these pawns over here and queen had come to d2. But honestly, it feels safe, and it does seem to make sense in the end. The king is safer than mine, at least, which is still in the middle of the board and can't castle yet. I did have some idea, maybe the king is going to walk up to g7, like go king f8, king g7, and then bring the rook out, sort of manually castling. But for now, I still had other plans working on trying to attack my opponent. So here I decided to play queen to c5, and maybe instead I should have first tried to go for this plan where I try and get the king safe, move the king out of the way. Does make sense, but I thought I wanted to reposition my queen here because I had some plans of just trying to attack my opponent down the c file, eventually start launching some pawns, see if we can deflect this knight over from c3 and put a lot of pressure down on this pawn on c2. So that was basically my plan with this, although it wasn't really a necessary move. I'm sure that it wasted a little bit of time, and instead I should have focused on bettering my king, getting it more safe, and then bringing this rook out on h8. So now he brings his rook over to d1, putting pressure down the d file, and I decide to play rook to c8, and we still got this plan of attacking down the c file. We're sort of forcing this knight to stay here on c3, like it can't move now because the c2 pawn would hang, so we're sort of pinning this knight down to this pawn. Now my opponent is going for a little bit of a knight maneuver, moving his knight back, and maybe it's going to come into e3. And I thought this is, again, a nice idea because then he can try and put a piece in this really important square in the center on d5. So this was some nice reroute from my opponent. Now here I decide to go for a reroute of my own. I want a knight on c4. So sometimes when I'm thinking of what I want to do in a position where I feel it's a little slow, there's not a huge attack happening, I just think, okay, if I could put a piece anywhere on the board, where would I put it? And I thought this knight would be really nice if it was on c4. So I decided and created a plan for me to reroute my piece over to c4. So that's why I decided to go for knight to g7 here. And then my opponent plays knight to e3. And now I put the knight on b6. We're controlling this d5 square, which is nice. So it stops really any ideas of them jumping into the center because we can just trade off, and this would probably make our lives a lot easier, especially because c2 is hanging. So they don't really have this plan to jump into the center anymore. He has to keep sort of shuffling and rerouting. My opponent now decides to push his queen up to this d3 square. I didn't exactly know what the point of queen to d3 was, but one thing I noticed about it was that we've now moved the queen off this diagonal. So now I can actually just castle safely. So I decide, all right, now let's just get the king safe, move it away out of trouble, and then we can bring our other rook into the game finally after all this time, untangle our pieces, now that the queen is not sort of targeting this h6 pawn and putting pressure on it. Now my opponent goes for another reroute. He goes knight to e2. And I didn't exactly know where this knight was planning to go. Maybe he just thought, all right, I want to get out of the way. Maybe I want to push c4, start pushing my pawns on this side. Maybe this knight is wanting to head over to g3, and then he's planning some f4 push in the future. But I wasn't really sure of exactly what my opponent was planning to do when he moved back here. I decided to keep trying to improve my pieces, so I put a rook over on d8. And at some point we're threatening to push forward with d5 and absolutely open the whole position up. But for now, this just moves a piece from a square where it wasn't doing a lot, and now it's reinforcing this pawn here on d6 and threatening to push forward with d5. My opponent keeps moving the knights around. He's moving this knight up to c1. So this knight goes from e2 to c1. And I think what they're planning is they want to go knight to b3 and attack my queen. And maybe after I go back, maybe this knight is even going to head into the a5 square. So it seems pretty clear that my opponent just wants to come around and attack my queen. So here, I decide to play the move knight to a4, attacking this pawn on b2. And then I thought if the knight comes to b3, then I can just head back to c7. It's really nothing to be too worried about. b2 is still under attack, so then you have to defend that somehow. So instead, my opponent goes for queen to b3. After knight a4, he moves his queen over here and is trying to maybe put pressure on this f7 pawn. And yeah, so I think here, again, I was like, okay, there isn't a huge threat here. I'm now going to put my bishop on g5. This bishop hasn't really been doing a whole lot except staring at this d6 pawn. So now we're moving out our bishop and starting to target something new. We're attacking this e3 knight. And now the queen is tied down to defending because otherwise we're going to capture, take with check, all that sort of thing if the queen is ever moving away. My opponent now plays knight to d3, and this is probably better than a knight to b3 plan from earlier on, because when this knight is coming to d3, it's more in the center of the board, so it's controlling a lot of squares in the center and forces me to move away. I move my queen back to c7, and then he brings rook over to c1. And here, there is the threat of if he does not defend this pawn that's on c2, if he plays something else, for example, putting the king on h2, all I can do is capture here, and after takes, this pawn on c2 is going to hang because the knight was defending it. So that is why he defends here by bringing rook to c1. Then I decide, all right, this knight on a4, it's had its day, let's move it back, let's take it back to this b6 square. So a lot of maneuvering in this game. My opponent then brings their knight up to the b4 square, and maybe they're threatening to jump in over here. I decide to immediately kick it away and play a5. Now my opponent jumps their knight into the center, and I think for a while of what I actually want to take with, because there's a couple of options here. Of course, I can only really think about taking with the knight or with the bishop. Of course, I can't really do anything else. Like if I play something like queen c6, he's got something like c4, threatening to open up the whole position, and suddenly white is back in the game. So I really should be trading off if I want an advantage. So the best way to take was to take with the bishop here. Obviously, my bishop was really just staring at a pawn, so it wasn't a very strong bishop. And then after captures, we can take here. And then if queen takes, the rook on c1 is hanging. So in this scenario, after takes, this knight can't really take because we're going to end up taking the rook that's on c1. So they need to take with the pawn. And then after that, we can put a knight on c4. And if the queen takes over here, there's tactics all over the place. Takes and takes, winning the exchange. So there's lots of tactics there. Instead, I decided to actually take with the knight. So this was a miss from me. I was just thinking at the time, I wanted to keep the two bishops on the board. And I think I was thinking a little too simply. Of course, I still had the ideas that if takes, you know, we can take and we can win this rook over here. But I wasn't thinking that hard about was the knight or the bishop more important to keep on the board, and I think it was more important to keep that knight. But anyway, I traded it off, he captures back, and then I play queen to c5, trying to add this pressure over on this knight on e3 again, and also defend this pawn that's on b5 that the queen's attacking. He then brings his rook into d3, and the plan is to slide over this way and attack my queen and try and get some trades. I decide to bring my bishop up to a6 because I wanted to make sure that I'm keeping on defending this pawn. It's on b5 because I was a little bit scared that, for example, if I don't defend it, let's just make a move here. If the rook comes over here and I go queen b6, maybe my opponent could try something like pushing a4. Now I realize now that I could just play b4, so that was really not something to be afraid of. But at the time, I was thinking, all right, let's defend. We can threaten to push forward with b4 at some point and open up that bishop as well. So another thought process behind it was that it put my bishop on a potentially more active diagonal. Now the rook comes in, attacking my queen, and I put the queen up on this d4 square, centralizing it. And he attacks my queen with the rook. And I thought about this, and I thought that the line I chose was the best, but there was actually something that was better, and it was to play a4. And after the rook takes here, we're going to take this queen that's on b3, and the rook moves back and captures, and after takes, rook is going to come to c8. And this is an absolutely crazy line with everything getting traded off, but black is a little bit better. So that was something I didn't even really consider. Instead, I decided to go for something a little bit different and capture on c3. So this is still better for black. So it was not a huge mistake by any means, but it just wasn't the best move here. So I thought if the queen is taking over here, I'm going to take back, and then the pawn structure is going to be a little bit ugly. They have some double pawns, they're all separated, and once I slide a rook over to c8, we can start attacking the pawns, and hopefully I'll be able to win some of them. And then of course, if they capture my queen, then I'm going to take their queen, and then they're going to be in a bit of trouble after I capture over here, and then I'm just up a rook. So that was what I calculated. What my opponent ended up doing, instead of taking with the queen, they decided to take with the pawn and keep the queens on the board, which is kind of a smart decision. They probably felt that they had more chances to turn this into a win if there's more pieces on the board, which definitely makes sense. But maybe it could have just fizzled out to a draw if we traded off everything. So I moved the queen back to c5, and my plan is just to target the c3 pawn and also the a3 pawn because they're very weak. Then his knight moves all the way back to f1, and I bring my rook into c8, attacking the pawn. He defends, bringing his rook in, and then I move my bishop up to this c1 square, attacking this pawn. At this point, my opponent just can't defend this pawn anymore, but there's still some ideas for tactics, so it's not all over just yet. My opponent plays knight to g3 here, and this knight is wanting to go to this square over on e4, attack my queen, attack this d6 pawn, and try and make some threats, be tricky with the knight. I decide to just take, and then this knight goes into e4, trying to infiltrate and attack me. I decide to play king to g7 here. Now, I did miss queen a1, which I did actually briefly look at, but I thought after bishop f1, I didn't really see what the follow-up was. Okay, so after rook c4, knight d6, a4. Oh, is this this is a queen trap. Okay, that's a cool idea. Okay, I didn't see that. Instead, I decided to play king to g7 because what I wanted to happen was I wanted to make sure that my king was always defending this f6 square. Like, I felt that they were going to try and come in and start attacking me, make some checks, and I just wanted to defend the square with my king, although it probably wasn't necessary. For now, I'm defending this d6 pawn with my queen, and if we trade off, then the bishop will defend, so it wasn't anything to be super worried about. So they trade, and then they bring their rook over to f3, trying to maybe infiltrate, bring the rook in, and start trying to take on d6. So I play rook to d8 here because I want to make sure that I defend this d6 pawn, and I'm able to move this bishop around without losing this pawn on d6. He then pushes forward with the pawn, and this is creating a little bit of a threat to try and win my bishop over here. Like, if I just take on c4, oops, I'm in a lot of trouble. because I'd be losing my bishop, but instead I push forward and play b4, and now I've got ideas of pushing a pawn, trying to create a pass pawn, and go for a queen on the A or B file. Here my opponent plays bishop to f1, defending this pawn that I was attacking on c4, and then I played bishop to c8. My plan was that I wanted to push f5 and attack this knight, get it out of the way, and start trying to push forward with all my pawns and overwhelm my opponent. He plays king to g2. My opponent said at the end of the game that he played g2 because he was worried about losing this h3 pawn at some point in the future. He wanted to be able to move the bishop and the rook without losing this h3 pawn, although I don't totally see what he was talking about. Maybe somebody in chat could explain it. But yes, he was also very low on time at this point. I should mention he was really, really low on time, so he was just trying to play as best as possible under time pressure. I now play f5, pushing the pawn forward. He takes, and I take with the bishop. And now I'm targeting this knight, also having a look at the c2 pawn with a bit of an x-ray attack. And now the bishop comes to d3 to defend. I play a4, and now the plan is just to keep pushing on this side, create a pass pawn, and make a queen. And now the knight goes back, and he's looking for a trade, but I'm actually very happy to get a trade here, because once I trade off these bishops, it's a lot more simple for me to push a pawn and promote the queen, because this knight is so far away, I can't really defend anything. So I go bishop to b2, moving my bishop over to this square where it controls the promotion square and helps me push forward with this a pawn. So after c3, I play a3, and you know, even though he can capture, my pawn can just keep pushing over here, and I'm going to make a queen on the next move, whatever happens. So there we go. I win game number 7. That was so exciting. I can't believe that I went 3 wins, 3 draws, and now another win again. So 2 rounds left to go in the tournament. I will have 2 recaps left to go as well. I hope you guys enjoyed this one. I'm sorry this was a long one. It's been complex games. I should probably try and make them shorter, but I hope you guys enjoyed, and have a wonderful day. Bye!